Hey everybody, what's up? It's Booksy. Today is Wednesday, March 2nd, and we're talking about AMC stock post earnings. So, if you didn't catch the earnings call, there was a lot to digest. I suggest finding a summary of it, or I posted a big tweet about it on Twitter. I didn't like live tweet it per se. I kind of did, but basically, like it's just really good all around, good fundamentals. And he definitely talked a lot about retail. He said that, yeah, he estimated somewhere close to 90% of the float, but it was based on that 4 million shares. He said, as far as he can tell, and he's looked at different metrics, that number hasn't changed significantly. I would be willing to bet that it did change from November up to about January, and that there was considerable sell off, but that recently, like a lot of retail has bought back in. And I'm not saying that to be negative. I just think that with the amount of selling volume that occurred, um, I don't think that was like 100% without paper hands, like people who just were like, I can't do this anymore. I got to get out. And certainly, like, it makes sense. I mean, if you bought in way back over here at $50, and you cut your losses, not everybody is gonna be holding on, through this whole thing. And it definitely makes sense to rebuy again, or at least average down if you had nothing else. So, in summary, um, man, we are like definitely in some weird Planet of the Apes type scenario where AMC is literally just kind of basing like a lot of their business decisions off of what retail wants, and that's a really good thing. I think in the end they're gonna diversify and their business model is gonna improve. And it's already really good. Like they're already coming back towards pre-pandemic levels, and they're improving it. So it's not like they're just trying to get back to pre-pandemic. They're going further, and that's a big deal. Um, Anyways, there's so much more I could talk about with that, but I just want to get into what happened after earnings with the stock price, which is basically nothing. If you look at where we are, we're up 1% today. It went down and then went back up. Super simple. And I did not expect there to be an explosive move because, or up or down, because unless it was like artificial, that makes sense. Because typically when you go into an earnings, a lot of these stocks, you'll either see them spike before earnings and then drop like a rock, or they'll drop like a rock before earnings and then they'll do just fine and then they'll rock it afterwards. But for AMC, it's kind of been like a mixed bag. If you go back and look at where all the earnings reports are, um, there's been times where, here, for instance, earnings seem to be kind of positive. Like I guess we sort of went up afterwards, and then same deal with here. We're kind of in the same region right now, in a way. And yeah, but I don't think that. I mean, there was the one before June, but I really don't think earnings has that much to do with it. I think it has to do with sentiment, which is really important. And I think it has to do with long-term value, which is really important for the company. But in terms of like the stock action, it hasn't really affected the way the fractals played out almost at all, in my opinion. So that being said, going into the day to day, we were expecting it to just sort of come down and iterate again. I didn't see a spring. I think I mentioned on Twitter, I said I didn't see it. I was like, I don't think that was the drop. I think there's going to be a little more. And there was a little more. And then as I was watching it in the morning, it was pretty flat. Like after this riotous action here, it kind of flattened out and then it started going down. And I'll be honest, I thought it was going to go a little further. I had said 1750, I think, to somebody at one point. And it was this idea that if you look and you compare, and this is just proportion, just visual proportion. If you look at these iterations, and what I mean by iterations, just copies, okay? And I went over this a little bit on Twitter. I went over it a little bit, I think, on the previous video. But yeah, this is 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. They're getting smaller and smaller every time. And initially, I thought this right here, this green section, was the top. So I was thinking we were going to come right back down, and this would be kind of our double, or like our little bounce here. It went further up, which is fine, and we got the bounce. And then at this point, I'm thinking, okay, well, more than likely, it's very, very likely that this is actually our proper arc. And that's really cool because we actually have, to a degree, an arc that we can follow. This is not like a guarantee. And the reason I can't guarantee it, see, I already moved it on accident. I'll have to shift it around a little, is because there are so many touch points that this could respect. And part of me thinks that this right here, see this one? This is the real touch point, and it kind of matches up, but you can shift it around a couple different ways. If you favor like the inside here, this inside curve, it seems that this is a touch point, and you can still get the one opposite over here, and it kind of just ignores this bottom. There's just so many different ways to do it, and that makes it really difficult because this curve is really important. But at the same time, it's not like so significantly important that if you're off by a little bit, you won't be able to see how this plays out. So all that being said, I know that was a lot. There's a lot that we could go over today in terms of the fractal. I don't want to confuse anybody because like I posted on Twitter, these comparisons between this larger region, right? From basically, let me show you, like this whole section right here. I compared this whole section to like this green section and to this green section because this is a red section down here. This is the spring action down here. This right here, whole area up here is a green section, right, on the macro, and then this is a blue section. That makes sense? So if you zoom out, that's what you see. If you zoom in, you can split these up into smaller sections. So one way that has, at least to me, like that I felt like was probably decently helpful was to look at this green section here. This is what I was talking about, right? And then compare it to each of these green sections. So I'm going to do that in this video right now and just show you some options about what may happen. And then we'll talk about what the expectations are for tomorrow and possibly into Friday. And that'll be that for this post-earnings video. So this one doesn't look very similar at first glance. I'd say you're pretty hard-pressed to make a case that is the same. However, if you look at first, you know, if you look at this particular shape, you can actually see there's quite a lot going on here. And it starts with, I'm missing my lines. This right here, you see this little top? It's a little head and shoulder that's kind of at an angle. We sort of have the same thing here, right? Now, this one, as you can see, there you go. After the hook, now you can kind of see it, right? So there's that little cat ear right here and the little paw in the sky. After that, it goes down and it creates a little double bottom. It goes up to another cat ear. Well, I would say that you see how this arc here is catching. I would say that there's actually one right here as well. And I had originally drawn the other arc that way, and I was confused because it didn't seem to be making any sense to me. I got rid of it not that long ago because I was like, nah, that's not right. But yeah, there's an arc here that you can kind of follow down. And so now when you look at it, it's not super weird. There's actually a case to be made that, here, let me shift this back over. You see how this comes down, it cascades all the way down, hits the arc, cascades down, hits the arc, coasts out sideways, right? Drops out, and then comes all the way down and does it again, up, but it's smaller, and then drops down again, but it's smaller. You get that crazy action that we saw right there, a little spike, right? And then eventually we get so small and we start turning up. And so that one actually fits the bill pretty well. It's just really elongated. For the second one, this one is smaller, and as you get smaller, things tend to get a little crazier. So you have to sort of come at it with that expectation that it's going to look really weird, and you may not be able to find it immediately. But I still think it's all here. I'm uncertain exactly about this one, but I do think that, again, it's all there. So, namely, what I'm looking at is, see this price action right here, and this price action right here. There's these like swoops, okay? And what this one looks like to me is that this is probably one top over here, and this is at an extreme angle. You know, this one comes up, and then as it falls down, we hit the bottom, we get that swoop right here, right? And the swoop kind of ends here with the cat ear coming out. So to me, this is not the best one because of how ugly it is, but it's okay. And then it comes out sideways. You get the spring action on the bottom. It's not particularly strong, but you do come up, and as it comes down here, I think you could say this region right here is the region that's supposed to propel you up into the blue. Final one, and this is the smallest, and therefore it's the most bizarre, but it actually ended up looking pretty clean. Usually it's the most bizarre. This one looked pretty clean. I mean, it's pretty much a one-to-one comparison. You can even see like the section that came right before looks pretty decent, similar. So the one thing here that maybe could be difficult is this, whether you interpret this as this top. I don't particularly think that's probably right. You see how there is that kind of swoop there. And I would say this flat section is this midway section, right? And we talked about this. This midway section right here is the same as this midway section, right, on this larger one. And you see it frequently, and you see it again right here, this midway. So I think this is a pretty decent example of what we should be seeing. There's this sort of sideways head and shoulder. AMC likes those for the push up into a T3. It's very common on a bullish action to see that. You see the same thing back in the May run. So if that's the case, how might that set up? Well, if we were just looking at this, I think it would be kind of difficult, because while there is some semblance of like a line here that you could follow, I don't know where that line would be here, because we have maybe this touch point. Maybe you see how there's two right here. And so perhaps once it hits this top region, we would expect to go. And it kind of makes sense, because you can see like that's where this macro arc, which is again just a movement arc, it's just to help me map it, that kind of is in the same pocket region. So it makes a little bit of sense. The big thing here is that every single one of these green fractals basically creates an SOS. On the other side, this is like a T3 setup, right? And so we would expect to see that near the top of the range, and it's happening right here, and it looks very similar to the one down here. So I'm feeling pretty bullish about it. If it broke down for some odd reason tomorrow, I wouldn't worry just yet. I would say that this could coast sideways along this line all the way through the end of the week if they really wanted it to. The big thing here is that you probably don't want to see it break below this trend line. There's a reason for that. And you wouldn't want to see it, definitely wouldn't want to see it just start dropping like really hard. If it did that, again, it would not necessarily be the end of the world. It could be that perhaps this needs to be out further. You know, this comes down, maybe it comes back up. We do land at like 18. All that being said, okay, now let's talk about what do I think in terms of fractal positioning, what's going on? So we iterated multiple times down to like a tiny fractal here, this sequence. And now that we're here, the natural direction in terms of like how this like has panned out would be to go up. And I've been tracking this fractal for a while according to this layout. And I guess this layout can look really intimidating at first glance. It's not that complicated. It's actually not. So I mark these by color, T1, T2, T3. And each of these sections contains those T1, T2, T3. And then some of them in these sections here, I'll make it bigger. Some of them in these sections, they do not break upward. All right, they break down. So in this case, you got the hook here, breaks down. You get the hook here, it breaks down. Hook here, it breaks down. For every other one, the spring action, this one technically does have a hook that breaks down, and then there's a really tiny spring down here. This is one of the exceptions. And this one does that as well. So this isn't like the end of the world type breakdowns. These are just things that move different directions. But yeah, every other one of these springs moves up. And I've been talking for a while, at least since mid-January, about my belief that this is basically the fractal. And there's nothing else. Like, this is the sequence right here. It has everything. It has your ups and downs, your accumulation, your distribution. It has all of the setup needed for a markup and a markdown, like if you needed it. Because think about it, on the macro, my belief is that we are basically right around here right now, where this Pepto-Bismol arrow is pointing. And back in November, we were over here. And we're doing this very large retrace, all right, of this region that we've already kind of come through, like with the T, basically with your January, 2020 up to now type stuff. I mean, this is very flat, but this normally sets up higher. So like, let me show you what I mean. This isn't the only example, but a lot of times this section down here will set up higher and then drop in. All right, and then you'll have a spring action. And I think all of this right here in Mark 3 is basically your January move. Okay. Mark 2 is actually all of that stuff that happens down here is a really long extended distribution into accumulation. And it's all that 2020 fractal. And then up here you have June to November. Okay. And now we're at this point where over 6 months later, and it kind of makes sense. Each of these sort of looks like about that amount of time. So it's actually, even timing wise, it kind of is working out like to be pretty accurate. So when you look at how these things set up, the left side of the spring, that would be like this side, and the right side of the spring are all present here as you go across this bridge, right? And the left side sets it up, but then it fails. And then the right side finishes it and it succeeds and it goes up. So each of these major springs, and there's a few, but specifically the ones I've been talking about are this one, which I've been calling major spring 2, and this one, which is major spring 3. 2 is the one that changes your direction. And that's the one that I said when it happened was right around here. And then 3 is the one that's going to lead you to a markup or a breakout back into the original upper region. But typically, and this is very common, on the arc, wherever that arc might be, 100% of the time, all right, I know you can't see the arc. Let me make it really, really ridiculous fat. There you go. 100% of the time, when you've got this arc correctly done, and it can be done in retrospect, okay? But 100% of the time, this upthrust here, this double upthrust that occurs after spring 3 here in this Mark 6 region, it exceeds wherever that arc is by a decent margin, and then it pulls back pretty hard. But beyond that, there's not a ton of rules about this top, except for just the general shape of it. You can kind of see how it sort of looks like it's forming a flag, but then it breaks down. Okay. And so I do think that's where we're going. I'm going to talk more about that in the macro. But today I was thinking about it, and I remembered that, and I'm not going to be able to show you the example because I don't remember where it is. But I remembered that there was this time that we saw this happen, this little spring form, and it's the right side. And this is like clicking, right, for me as I'm witnessing it happen. This happened a while back. I think it might have been in this region, maybe over here, but I think it was actually, I can't even remember. It was this really, maybe it was right here or something like that. I wish I could remember because it was a really significant moment because I realized that this right here was a right side only of a spring. And I remember when I drew it, I got this weird beak shape and I thought that doesn't look like the correct thing. Oh, now I remember. It was the day that I was posting, and some of you, if you follow me on Twitter, you probably remember this, but it was the day that I was like, this looks super weird. There's something going on with the market because all of a sudden it looks like our fractal just shrinking to infinity. And then it broke out. We got that spring 3, and then we actually saw the rest of the actual fractal. And I remember saying, that looks super weird. It can't be that small. It looks like the whole thing. Well, later I went back and I realized that, I didn't want to delete that. I went back and I realized that, of course, that would be the case because I had this hypothesis, this idea that the left side sets it up and the right side finishes it. So the left side sets up the fractal, but then it fails and drops down. So it segments. I got a whole video about segmenting. Go look at that if you don't know what I'm talking about. It's like 2 minutes. It's super fast. And then on the right side, it completes. So for a little while, I've been looking at how that might happen. And the only way that I could think that it might happen was this, that somehow when you set up on the left side, the right side, and I think I mentioned this in the very last video I did, the right side kind of lands on the top of that line. And you can only really see it, you can only really see it in this one in retrospect, because if you had drawn a line originally here, you would have been like this, right? And you'd been like, no, it rejected off of it. And I'd be like, yeah, it did. But I noticed this, and so I tested it out. And I drew all these lines, and these were the ones, so I'm going to come back to this exclusively. These are the ones, all these rainbow lines here, that were attached to all the cat ears on the left side, the top of those cat ears, which would be the top line on that fractal. And my idea was that, well, if this works out, and it might, that basically this should set up the left side, or excuse me, the right side should set up opposite a similar sized fractal that occurred on the left. So you basically have, I know this is getting confusing, but you have like nested springs, right? So you've got like this right here is one that we just saw. And the left side was completed on the right side, right? And then what happened is we got a little spring action. You see that? And that's where this blue arc came from. You see this blue arc? The reason that I had drawn these different arcs, I had a blue one, I have the green one, see the green one? And I have this big pink one, is because they correlate to other the fractal, basically the arcs correlate to this particular idea here. So if you have the left one, you should be able to draw an arc and it point to the top of the right one. And it worked perfectly. Like I actually got that target down, like exactly where I thought it would be, which was $21. And there were other things that I pointed out, like speed lines and stuff. And the speed lines went to like $23. And I said, well, maybe if it overextends, on a push up, it can go to 23. I didn't really see that as a big deal because when you look at these, it's like pretty easy to just like extend them. And I was like, well, if the speed lines point to 23, maybe that's where it's going to go. It didn't end up doing that, but it followed this arc like perfectly. So then I was like, well, maybe if it did it this time, and it sure enough, it landed on top of this line. And now it went back, it did go back through it. So that's important to note. Perhaps, like I'm not going to try to fudge anything, but it definitely went back through it, like on a glance. But it did land on top of it, right? And I think that it's going to do the same thing for this one right here on a larger scale. And this is going to be your spring 3. So it's kind of like, think about one spring here that's tiny. And then it expands out. And then this is the next spring right here. And then this is like the next spring. And then the next spring right here. So I'm only doing 3, but there could be technically like infinite amount. I prefer to not hurt my brain. So the other thing I noticed, again, remember that beak thing. So that beak thing made it look like this was a right side. And it came from this particular cat ear sequence over here. And so if you're looking at this right here, you draw it, you see the hook touches it, and then it kind of baselines right there. And it creates this really interesting like arc pattern. This is super obscure. It only seems to matter for something like AMC, right? I wouldn't take this somewhere else necessarily, but I noticed it and I made a note of it like a long time ago when that happened. Wasn't that long ago, probably. And I was like, okay, so maybe this is something that's normal. And it almost looks like that's the other side of the spring. So that's what I did. Now, that being said, what this yellow line is attached to is this hook right here, and then this base. And there's not really any other way to kind of make it. You can kind of stretch it out maybe, but that seems to be correct. And then the same with these touch points. They hit these 2 tops here. And you would want to maybe go all the way over here, but again, it almost doesn't matter. You see how it makes very little difference. This is pretty narrow. So the only way to draw this is a pretty narrow beak, so to speak. And once I kind of was like looking at that and I looked at the sequence here, what we would expect to see, it fits really well. And it should. The other thing I wanted to say is that there you go. This is what we've been expecting, right? This like final sort of mountain setup here, which will look a little like a T3, but on an edge, like a bowl shape. So you'll have like a cup, but then you'll have a handle that sets up like way high. So you have like the cup here, but the handle that sets up way high. But really like this is, and see how this ends up being like the highest point of volume. Isn't that interesting? But it's ramping up. So it's possible that this cup and handle sets up lower, like this whole thing forms a cup, and then the handle actually sets up like down here. But the point is like this is pretty unique to this region, and I think the reason it looks the way that it looks, why it ramps so much, is because each of these little things is like finishing off a spring that was started over here. So it's got a lot of momentum behind it. But yeah, so basically looking at the next couple days, again, if it broke down here, not the end of the world. You can see that this does come down pretty hard at one point. I kind of think we just did it. And to me, I don't really see a point in doing it again. But we also can't take for granted the fact that this is like 5 minutes and this is like 10 minutes. And we're looking at 3 days versus a few days. So it's possible that it could dip down and then start moving up. And we really don't see a lot of action this week. But if tomorrow we do get a breakout and we start moving, then what I would expect is to come up and touch this inner arc. And I know you might be thinking like, well, where is that at in your drawing? Well, I don't have all of those arcs drawn here because this is a tiny little area and it already is pretty cluttered. But basically, like, I'm just drawing, like, looking at like this, okay? Looking at this particular shape going up to the top here, like that. And you can see that it comes up and then it comes back down. So even though this is like a 1 or a 3 minute time frame, you can see that there is price action that's pretty volatile. So it comes up, it looks like it's going to break into this arc, and then it comes all the way back down, and then it runs. And this would also sort of work with max pain this week if it did run quite a bit. Maybe it sort of breaks out of this region, comes up pretty hard, tests the bottom of this make-believe arc that's not there yet, but I think will be. And then it comes back down. And you can see like where it comes down to is it comes down to this particular line here, right? Which is this high point, which is our recent high point. And in our case, it is 1943. And not perfectly convinced about that because as you see here, like in this one, it almost acted like a sort of support. But in this case, it was a little more of a resistance. So sure, like it's possible that we come down to this region instead, this 1852. I wouldn't be like crying about it. It's like $1, right? But yeah, sure, that's possible. Right now, this is what I'm what I'm going with, this 1943 level. But yeah, you can see how like if let's say it did that by the end of the week, then yeah, you'd end up down in 1943. That's not too far off from where max pain is. So to me, like that's not super unreasonable. But yeah, anyways, then Monday we would be expecting like a bigger run. And the rest of it sort of plays out from there, much the same that we would see here. If we had a gap, for instance, right here, maybe over the weekend, perhaps then we gap fill. There's no gap here, but this all happened intraday, like during the day. So, but yeah, it came back, it tested this again, and then it took off. So I would think it would come back to 1943 and then take off. What's interesting about this is that it never quite comes back here again. It doesn't ever breach this level again. Now, if you start over analyzing this, it's kind of like, well, maybe this, maybe that, you can't really say because, and I agree, you can't really say because frankly, like, let's say we took this down here. You can see that kind of worked too. And that makes me think, okay, well, where is that? That's the hook. And this is where things start getting a little bit muddy because suddenly then it looks like, all right, well, does this point us to like an inevitable, spring that's going to be really low? I don't know. And I have a bearish scenario where the spring comes back down at the end. And I'm wondering like how much that lines up. But for now, I'm just going to be a little bit more optimistic about it. And I want to look at this and just say, okay, well, possibly this could be a possible bottom, like that we never actually come back here again. And this set up in a way that made sense for this time frame. But in our time frame, the VPVR makes me think that this whole region doesn't need to be traded again, not really, and that will set up higher, more towards the top of the range. and not come back down. So anyways, for the foreseeable future, this is what I'm thinking. And I'm gonna stick to it. The next video that I make will be the macro video. It's gonna be pretty dense, and I'm gonna try to make it as full as I possibly can. I know that people are eager to sort of see how that may have updated from the last one I did. The only other videos I'll be releasing for AMC are going to be just a really basic overview of how I read this fractal. It's going to kind of work a little bit off of this right here. But I'll talk about a few different things to help you when I'm not tracking this like every day, so you can track it and make sense of it yourself. And hopefully it'll be like a little guide that can help out. So I won't do a lot of videos for that. It's probably going to be like maybe like 4 quick 5-minute videos. I'll pre-plan them and make sure that they're short so they can be used as a resource. But that's it. That's all I got for you right now. Hopefully the rest of this week is very good in terms of price action. I do expect some serious volatility within the next 3 to 4 days at the least. And yeah, the only thing that would be really surprising to me at this point is if we just started going down. Like I wouldn't know what to make of that. Maybe you could say we were in this region. If that happened, yeah, we would have to. I mean, it'd be a complete reassessment of the arcs and everything. It would have to. But anyways, that's all I got for right now. Hope you all have a good one, and I'll talk to you later.